Self-righteousness helps no one, least of all the person who is self-righteous. Why? Because it's a lie the flesh-based ego tells itself in order to stay relatively sane in its malfunctioning state. The ego is driven to attachment to that which it likes, agrees with, and thus accepts as good. It is also driven to aversion to that which it dislikes, disagrees with, and thus rejects as evil. It treats these things as either survival necessities or survival threats, and the brain responds accordingly. Self-righteousness reassures the ego that I am good, and thus not to be rejected as evil. When the ego registers the self as bad or evil, it registers itself as a threat, and therefore to be rejected, feared, driven away, or destroyed. This causes a panic in the system because of the contradiction which must be resolved. The like-dislike mechanism, or good-bad, must be adjusted to compensate, which we call justifying oneself. It is this panic and this complex difficulty in resolution which is the source of many, if not most, psychological disorders. Self-righteousness is the lie the ego tells itself that if you follow these rules or this code of conduct that you agree with, then you will be good, and thus a survival necessity to be protected and or hoarded. Self-righteousness is a lie because it does not actually fix the underlying error and cannot. It is literally the error trying to compensate for itself and failing miserably. It is also harmful because it cannot easily take into account moral contradictions where following the rule or code of conduct results in harm to someone or an undesirable outcome which is deemed a threat to the ego. It produces a nonsensical result to the ego, which then triggers that same existential panic, which must be resolved in order to maintain relatively normal operations. This is why where Paul writes that the Torah is good, speaking of the Mosaic law, he is absolutely correct. There is nothing wrong with the codes of conduct laid out in the Torah, at least not in the society of the ancient world, that is. Not murdering people, not stealing, not craving what isn't yours, and loving your neighbor as yourself are in fact good things to practice. If there was a code of conduct which could have delivered someone from their malfunction, then it would have been the Torah, as Paul writes. The problem isn't the Torah. The problem is the malfunctioning ego that takes the code of conduct, agrees with it, and then decides that there's nothing wrong with itself as long as it keeps those rules. But because it is not actually governed by those rules, but by its own likes or dislikes that it cannot hold, that is, what it considers to be a survival necessity or a survival threat, and either craving or aversion and reaction. Because the Torah is spiritual, but I am fleshly, sold as a slave, subject to the malfunction, as Paul wrote. Attempting to define your goodness, your own personal right state of being, by keeping the Torah, the instructions of the New Testament, or any moral code of conduct only triggers the malfunctioning ego to more malfunctioning responses, whether in compliance with that code of conduct or defiance of it. The moral code of conduct can do nothing, absolutely nothing, about the hardwired human malfunction which afflicts each one of us. Thus, self-righteousness from rule-keeping of any kind, or anything which allows the ego to place itself in the category of good, is a self-deception produced by that malfunctioning ego in order to maintain its own relative sanity, in the programming sense of sanity. In order to actually deal with the malfunctioning ego, it has to be bypassed altogether, and a new origin or sense of responses and behaviors inserted. Thus, the cross, the union with the Spirit of Christ, and the voluntary ability to submit to and cooperate with the Spirit of Christ so that it is He who acts and speaks through us, thus giving those words and actions a genuinely, correctly functioning source from His genuine right state of being.